Thank you, Victor. Victor's also awesome. Give it up for Victor. He's awesome. Yes. So thank you so much for having me. I've never been to a Creative Mornings meeting. Just heard about it through Victor this year. I'm so excited that we have this happening in Orlando. I think it's a really wonderful sign that our community has changed a lot in the last 15 and 20 years to embrace our creativity and celebrate it, and love that we have this creative class here in Orlando now. So I am Rachel Simmons. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I do, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about the places that I've been, and tie it all together under this theme of climate. So watch as this all comes together. Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, I teach over at Rollins College. I've been there for about 15 years teaching. I also went to school at Rollins, and so it's really my home. And I actually live on campus now in a first-year residential hall with my family. So it really, really, really is my home. I am the printmaker there, and so I pretty much have a dream job. I work with letterpress, screen printing, monotype, collograph. I teach landscape drawing. I teach all the book arts classes, so book binding and altered books and visual journals. It's pretty sweet, I gotta say. So in my work, I do all of that stuff. I'm pretty multifaceted in terms of my art practice. I also make work about the environment. It's one of the things that I care a lot about, and it comes out of my work. And I would say that I'm quite collaborative in my studio practice. So not only do I work with groups of school kids, but I work with scientists, I work with historians, and my practice is very much about engaging the public in a dialogue about the things that my work is directed to, the environment. So throughout the talk, you'll hear these 4 themes. One is sort of about my research practice. So how do I get an idea? Where does it come from? What are my kind of sources of inspiration? Travel has been a big influence in my work. I'm very, very lucky at Rollins to have a lot of very interesting travel experiences supported by my institution. So I have been to Antarctica twice, Iceland several times, Galapagos several times. I've been just recently to Namibia and Southwest Africa. Been all over the place. So those experiences have really influenced my work, and I choose those locations very specifically to tie in with what I want to research. Other themes that you'll see are the theme of community and using the community as a way to take action. So not just to make work that's going to go in a gallery or museum somewhere, but work that's going to go into a public school or a library or be created by the public and not even by myself. And finally, I'll talk about my journal practice, which is the way that I reflect on all of this stuff that I get to do, and my teaching, my life, all of the things that I think give me a quiet, more introspective space for my creativity. Something that if you're working as designers, you're always using your creativity in the service of other people, right? We're always coming up with great ideas for other things that people are going to use. But do we allow that space in our lives for our own private creative practice? It's pretty important for creatives to have that outlet, so I'll talk about that as well. So my research is really an interesting mix of my love for science. So as a kid, fascinated by science, always thought science was a way to figure things out, new discoveries. I was very intellectually curious as a child and still am. And so a lot of the science resources that I like are the ones that I remember from my childhood. So we always had a stack of National Geographics at my house. We always had, we had Jacques Cousteau. You guys are too young to remember Jacques Cousteau, but I had Jacques Cousteau. You know, all these really fun, like, kids' science books. I still love that stuff. I still love this nostalgic kind of science that I remember from my childhood. Another place where I've recently found some interesting ideas is this book called Hyperobjects, Philosophy and Ecology After the End of the World by Timothy Morton. And one of the ideas in the book that's so interesting to me is the notion that climate change is a hyperobject. And his idea about hyperobjects is pretty straightforward. It's something that's so complex and so massive that we can't actually see it. We can only see the traces of it or the effects of it, but you can't really point to one thing and go, that's climate change, right? Which is what makes climate change so difficult politically. It's what makes it so difficult for us to imagine tackling. It's massive and complex and kind of daunting. And this is really interesting. He talks a lot about how it can't even be visualized by human beings. But that's what I've been making art about for like 10 years, it's climate change. So obviously I'm trying to visualize it. And it makes a lot of sense in terms of how diverse my practice has become, how I've tried just about everything possible to visualize climate change in my work. So if we think of climate change as the proverbial iceberg, the tip is only visible, and then there's all this stuff underneath it. So when I think about climate change, the kinds of things that I'm thinking about are ecotourism, what a wilderness is, evolutionary adaptation, we've got biodiversity, fossil fuels, sustainability, mass extinction. Anybody go see Maya Lin recently at OMA? Yeah, she has a whole project on extinction now. It's called Her Last Memorial, and it's a memorial to species which are going extinct. So there's a lot to talk about when you talk about climate change. There's an awful lot there. So one of the first questions I wanted to answer was this idea of wilderness. So E.O. Wilson, who's a biologist, talks a lot about biophilia, this idea that we need wildernesses. We need them psychologically. We need them biologically. We need to be out in the wilderness from time to time as human beings. And it's part of us resetting our completely manufactured, stressful lives that we carry out from day to day. It's a reset button. So there aren't that many wildernesses around anymore, right? True wildernesses. I mean, you really have to go to great lengths to find one. So I thought I would try to go to Antarctica and see if there was anything like a wilderness there. It's the only continent that's not owned by any one particular person or country. It's just for science. It's just there for science. It's been preserved by science and for science. So I thought that was a really intriguing idea. And I got to go in 2008 and 2009, and I took a crap ton of photos. Oh my goodness. Did I spend a lot of time behind my camera? Probably too much time behind my camera. It's lucky I got to go again. And I left my camera battery at home the second time. I think that was like kind of on purpose. So I didn't spend my whole time behind the camera on round two. But I just couldn't help myself. It was just amazing. Icebergs and glaciers and penguins and leopard seals. So I wanted to document so I could come home with a whole bunch of raw material that I could work with and make art. So when I was there, I took, like I said, a lot of photographs. And I would work with them when I got back in my studio, creating these mixed media drawings. And a lot of the things that I was thinking about in Antarctica had to do with the carbon footprint that I'd created just getting there, right? The planes that I'd taken, the Russian icebreaker that I had to cross the Drake Passage with, the food that I had to eat, all of the fuel that had to be expended just to get me and the other 99 passengers there. So it's an interesting dilemma that any ecotourist finds themselves in. They want to go to these places, they want to try to conserve these places, so they go so they can come back and tell the story of these places to other people. But you create a footprint while you go. There's no escaping it. And it creates a really interesting tension in my work. That was the Russian icebreaker that I took to Antarctica twice. And it's now a ghost ship in the Atlantic. Did you hear about this ship? It broke away as they were hauling it away for scrap. And it was piloted by rats out in the Atlantic. And no one ever found it. It's like a mystery ship. It's like a Scooby-Doo mystery ship being driven by rats across the Atlantic. And so there it is, the Lubila Orlova. So another piece that I created out of this series was called the Guide for Ecotourists. And it was conceived of like a map with, there's the representation of the ship. And you'll see this text repeated, "We do as we please." So a lot of what I was thinking about was our sense of entitlement as Westerners to travel wherever we would like, wherever we can, and to do whatever we like when we travel. So on this ship there were, I would say, a very wide variety of types of travelers. Travelers who were maybe accustomed to a little bit more luxury, and travelers who were not. And one of the travelers that I befriended was a Swiss banker who had retired at age 30 and was traveling the world. And all he wanted was a big Argentinian steak. That's all he wanted. He just kept talking about it the whole time we were on the ship. And as soon as we got off the ship, he got a big giant steak. And I was trying to talk to him about steak and how it was clearly delicious, but did you know that it had a really big carbon footprint, steak, because cows consume so much of our natural resources, and then there's the methane issue, cow farts. And so, you know, he was just like, oh, you know, Swiss banker guy. He didn't care. He didn't care about any of that stuff. But I did challenge him to try to calculate the miles that he traveled on his trip around the world. And I just got him to start thinking about it. I didn't nag him. I just wanted him to think about it. I thought, if you're taking a trip around the world, what a great opportunity to try to calculate your footprint for that trip around the world. But it just got me in mind of thinking about how we don't think about our impact as often as we should. We do as we please when we feel entitled to do so. So my most recent trip actually was this past summer. A group of Rollins faculty and staff went to Namibia in the southwest of Africa. Namibia is a really fascinating place to go. It is only about 15 years old as a nation, so they are fresh from a revolution. Before they gained independence, they were essentially a colony of South Africa. So they had the apartheid system in place. And before that, they were a German colony. And they underwent a genocide. So they could potentially, upon being independent, they could have devolved into chaos or anarchy or had a civil war. Once they claimed independence, though, they have been a very peaceful nation. They have one of the most progressive constitutions in Africa, which includes environmental protections in their constitution. It's even more progressive than our constitution. They also have protections for women and children built into their constitution. So they're a really interesting African nation to visit. The landscape is incredible. It's a desert country, but they are on the water. And interestingly enough, they have one of their biggest industries is fishing, and they have rich fishing grounds off the coast because of a current from Antarctica. So it's an interesting tie between those two countries. Here we are on one of the biggest sand dunes in Namibia. It's a very arid place for the most part. So it's about the size of California, but only has 1 million inhabitants. It's very spread out. So what does a country like this do? A country that has these amazing landscapes and wildlife. And traditions, cultural traditions. Well, they've actually embraced ecotourism. It is now their third largest industry behind mining and fishing. And you could see, like, amongst those three, one could clearly be more sustainable than the others. And so, you know, they have ecotourism degrees that you can earn at the University of Namibia. It's very interesting. The tour guide that we had was highly educated, spoke several languages, knew as much about astronomy as he did about giraffes, as he did about how deserts are formed. And so, and having been an ecotourist in many parts of the world, I was really impressed by our guide and by all the people that I came into contact with. In Namibia, we went to a very interesting eco lodge, all solar powered, 100% solar powered in Namibia, called the Grootberg Lodge. And it really in the middle of nowhere, in a place that's already in the middle of nowhere. So it took quite a long time to get there. There were lions around, so we couldn't walk around at night. And there are more of these lodges being formed. This particular lodge was formed by a local tribe, but run by a German company. And just like all the places I've ever been, I'm always looking to see who's profiting from the ecotourism industry. Is it the local community, or is it some company in Europe or Canada or the US? And that's always a good question to ask if you find yourself at an eco lodge. You're thinking, oh great, eco lodge, really good for the people, great for the local economy, great for the animals, great for the environment. But sometimes those things can be assumptions that we make, and it's always good to sort of get there and ask questions. This is the back of the lodge, looking out over this, what I thought was like a matte painting from the movies. It just didn't even look real to me. This is their pool that just like, there's like a sheer drop right at the end of the pool, like 1,000 feet down. It's like the Grand Canyon of Namibia. It's pretty amazing. We also went to a Himba village in Namibia. The Himba are a tribe in the north. They also live in Angola. And there are these villages that, coming from the land of Disney, I couldn't help but be a little cynical about the village because we paid to go in, and then they showed us their handicrafts and demonstrated things about their village life. The men are all dressed in Western clothes, and that's because during the war with South Africa in the 80s and 90s, they were conscripted into the army, and they took on Western traditions, and they never went back. But the women and children still dress in traditional garb. But they were clearly putting on a display for us, a show, and we couldn't help but wondering, did they actually sleep there at night or just go to a kind of more Western looking house at night and come to the village during the day? You know, and all of these ideas about, can you create an authentic eco-tourist industry and still like maintain your own identity without becoming Disney-fied yourself, right? Putting yourself on display. What does that do to your culture and the integrity of your culture over time? It's all really interesting questions. So for this trip, I decided to take a journal, and the journal is an altered book. So that's when you take a book and you cut it up, paint over it, destroy it, deconstruct it, reconstruct it, and you're having a dialogue with that original text while you're doing that. And so actually I brought it with me today. There's a whole bunch of journals over there on that table, which you're welcome to look at when we're done. There was just an article on the Weekly on this particular work. If you saw that, you'll know a little bit more about it. But my idea was to take this text. It's from the 80s. It's called The Africans by David Lamb. And he was a Western journalist who lived in Africa for 4 years. And he, you know, was an educated guy and very compassionate and empathetic towards what was happening in the 80s in Africa, which is very much this post-colonial independent movement. Lots of dictators like Idi Amin were in power. And so, you know, it's an interesting read for me, a child of the 80s, to go back and understand what the assumptions were on the behalf of Westerners about the continent of Africa, and then trying to examine my own assumptions about the place, because I'd never been to the continent at all before this summer. And then to try to unpack all of that while I was there, seeing the reality of what an African nation is like. And so that was a really interesting process for me to go through. I did a lot of the journal on site while I was there, on the bus. My writing is really hard to read sometimes because I was on this crazy bus driving across Namibia where most of the roads are not paved. And so I had a lot of time on those long bus rides to reflect on the things that we were experiencing. So the book has a lot of multi-layered textures. Sometimes I'm interacting with the text, so it's sort of like an erasure poem where you find words in a text and you block out the rest and you make a new text out of what you've left behind. And other parts of it are a little bit more me imposing something new completely over the existing text. Oh, SWAPO was the party that brought the nation to independence in the 90s. So it was a really interesting project for me. It taught me a lot about what I thought I knew about Africa and what I was experiencing about it, which I think is always a great role for art to take on in your life to help you understand what you're thinking, what your assumptions are, what your biases might be, and how to unpack all of that. Oh, and the sky in Africa at night is quite stunning if you're out in a rural area. And the constellations are all slightly different from at home when you look up. It's really interesting. Just a couple pages from there. So another thread that runs through my work is community. A lot of what I do is socially engaged art. So that means that I'm interested in coming into a community and making some work with them, but the real aim is not necessarily the work that we make, it's the relationships that we build. So this is another project of mine called Future Bear. I collaborate with a number of people on Future Bear. One of them is Julian Chambliss, who's also a professor at Rollins, who's been involved in urban rethink. And what is Julian not involved with? That's what I would like to know. The list of, that's a small list, that's what I'm saying. So Julian is a comic book expert, and a couple years ago we did TEDx talks together, and he practiced and I practiced, and we got to know each other's material quite well. And I had been doing these paintings of this bear who was flying around with a jetpack, and sometimes she had gills, and I was kind of tired of the polar bear being depicted always as this like thing near extinction that was always drowning or being trampled or killed, or just was tired of that symbol of it as a victim because it's such a powerful animal. I thought it'd be really interesting to transform it from a victim into a superhero, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do with it. And Julian, of course, immediately said, "Oh, that's a superhero. Like, it needs a story." I said, "It's a she." He's like, "All right." So that's Julian. So yeah, we made this whole like wall-based comic book called Future Bear, and he wrote the story for it, which is really exciting. It starts out in Norway with these scientists who are trying to send this genetically enhanced bear back in time to tell us here in our current day to stop messing up the planet and to give us constructive advice on how to fix things. You know, because she's from the future and she's really smart. She knows what's going to happen, so she can totally tell us how to fix things. And because I have an 11-year-old, I was always like, okay, no violence. You know, I'm not into all this like violence in comics. It's got to be like family friendly. We did have a discussion about laser claws at one point, which, you know, that could find its way in. I'm just saying, get ready. You might see laser claws one day. But she's a mom and has 2 cubs, you know. She's like feminist superhero on top of everything else. So that's a photo of the whole installation. And so you see these like text panels and image panels. So it does have roots in comics. And Julian's really interested in infusing this historical narrative about the environment. So, you know, we've always had anxieties about what we're doing to the environment. He's an American historian, so At one point of his specialty is at the turn of the century during the industrial age, when we were all living in these terrible conditions in cities like New York and Boston. And we wanted to escape to the West, manifest destiny, to get to, out of the slums. And there are a lot of comic book narratives about like Batman, Gotham, terrible slum, crime-ridden city. All of that narrative also has to do with the environment of the city being a sick or ill or not a healthy place to be. So we roped in another collaborator, Stu Helm, who's a graphic designer in Asheville, North Carolina, who does this awesome like weekly kids comic mailer. And so he designed the Future Bear mission book, which I brought copies of. You guys can take a copy with you today. Especially if you've got kids at home, it's geared for around between 3rd and 6th grade-ish, although I've had middle schoolers love it too. So it's meant to take the Future Bear narrative and make it into games and puzzles that help kids both engage with the story of Future Bear, and also they help me finish the story, because the end of the first issue is a cliffhanger. She gets transported in time, doesn't go to Canada where she would be totally inconspicuous. She lands in the Florida swamp with no gear, and she's tased immediately by the park rangers. She doesn't die. The kids are always like, "Why'd you kill her?" I'm like, "She's not dead." And so the kids are invited to finish the story. So we've been collecting these stories for like a year and a half now from kids. And kids have the best imagination ever. They are not hung up like adults are about what's possible. They're like, "Oh yeah, well, she went to Alaska and then she was airdropped. And then she went back in time, she brought her clone back with her. And they're gonna, it's amazing, the stories that they've come up with." So we had this up two places this year. Once in the Cornell Fine Arts Museum at Rollins, and it's been at the Dunedin Arts Center over in St. Petersburg. And every time we try to do these very interactive talks with kids of different ages, from little kids to, I think these kids were from high school, actually, and asking them to help us finish the story. So this past semester, I had my Rollins College students work with some 5th graders over at Park House Academy. It's a small school in Winter Park. And they were charged, we got a grant through United Arts to have them create work together based on the Future Bear narrative. And we had a great time together. They made all kinds of really fun expansions into the Future Bear universe, which included board games, card games, t-shirts, posters, story cubes. Here they are at the Rollins print shop learning how to work platen presses. Has anybody ever played with the platen press? It's a kind of letter press. It's from mine are from 1920 and 1950, and they also got to work on the Vandercook cylinder letter press, which is from the 60s. So all really cool stuff. They got to do screen printing, and we had a ball. So my students created all this work with them that has now expanded the Future Bear narrative even further. Julian refers to it as the Future Bear Empire. I think that's a little imperialist. Here's one of the kids with this card game that another of my students helped him make. And of course, they all got medallions because they're winners, part of the Future Bear family. So given that I have all this stuff going on, both my own work and then these socially engaged projects, I really like to spend time journaling. It keeps me sane. So I used to just do journals mainly when I traveled, and I brought my Antarctica journal. It's up there. This is a page from my Antarctica journal from 2009. And so it would help me on these trips. There's a lot of traveling when you travel. Hello. So sometimes you're on a boat for 2 days waiting to get somewhere, or a bus for 8 hours, and so you have time to do these sorts of things. So I always bring this like crazy knapsack of art supplies, and I'm always journaling. It helps me really process what's going on. I just, with Victor's help actually, turned one of my journals into my first mass-produced work of art. It's called Never Flinch, And it's autobiographical, which is new for me in terms of my work. It's not often that I do autobiographical work. But it's a journal that helped me reflect on all those threads that run through my work, my teaching practice, my studio practice. I'm a mom, you know, all the challenges and interesting things that I get to do, and help me kind of put it all into perspective. I teach a journaling class, and it's always my favorite class. The students really are trying to figure out who they are. They're 18, 19, 20, and it's a really important moment in your life to try to figure out, like, who am I? Who would I like to be? And so journaling's been really important for them too. So I have a copy of the journal. I have the real original journal up there, and then the published copy up there if you're interested in looking at it. It has stuff about my family, my travels. This is a page about going to the Galapagos and snorkeling off the side of this island, and the tour guide blithely explaining that she used to see hammerheads in the thousands off of this island, and if we were lucky we would see some hammerheads today. And I was like, no, it's okay if we don't. We could see them while I'm on the boat, maybe. Or orca. She would say there would be orca swimming in the water with us. Yeah, so like all the time when I'm doing these trips, I'm always like slightly terrified, but I do it anyway. Yeah. Also, there's stuff in the journal about what it's like to be an artist. Hi, not all glamorous, lots and lots of work. And so I have pages in there that talk about, you know, that it's actually just a job, that nobody's like really a creative genius, that we all just work really hard at the things we like to do. Pages on travel, and pages about art. I teach contemporary art and theory, and we talk a lot about what art is, what it means, why we should care about it, what people have written and said and tried to, how they've tried to define art over time. And, you know, just pages about my family. I think that's really important to get to know an artist when you're, and to get to know yourself through your family as well. So that's it. Thank you very much. And there's examples of all this stuff up there, and take a mission book and a card with you today. Thank you.
All right, so we have time for a few. Sorry, we have time for a few questions. Is anybody? Rachel, what do you say? If you could like repeat the question.
Yeah, sure.
Questions?
Where's the next place you'd like to travel?
Ooh, that's a good question. Where's the next place I would like to travel? I have another option to travel soon. I am considering going to Cuba. There's a group of faculty going to Cuba, and I'm really interested in that. Cuba's going to rapidly change now that our policy towards Cuba has changed, and I'm really interested in sort of seeing that and maybe heading back in 15 years to see it again, to see what impacts it has. Tourism is huge in Cuba also. I also do a project in Iceland though, and my family's been with me both times, and they are always wanting to go back, and who can blame them? It's pretty cool. So yeah, thank you. Yep.
How, with climate change, how do you keep your, obviously it's unfortunately been turned into this political pond, and so you hear lots of ridiculous things happening for that reason. How do you continue to be, how do you not get discouraged doing a project like this when you hear that sort of thing?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. So how do you continue to make work about climate change, which is so politically polarized, and how do you not get discouraged? Yeah. Well, I think you can make work about the things that discourage you, right? Because that's a place where you're passionate, where your passion meets some kind of confrontation that's happening in the world. I don't think that my work is solving climate change. I think it's more about maybe developing one's awareness of one's kind of position in the hyperobject of climate change. And so, you know, we live inside of this system, right? Like, I can't suddenly lift myself out of the system that we've created on Earth, where we drive cars and use fossil fuels, and everything we do is related to that. So I live in this world. I can't just extract myself from it. So I've got to deal with it on a really practical day-to-day basis. And I think of my work as ways to explore the issues that catch my attention that are related to climate change. And I don't have any solutions. I just have questions. I have a lot of questions. And I just want to ask those through my work so that other people can be asking themselves the same questions and thinking about it. And I think is the role of art, really, is to ask questions and make sure that we all feel safe about asking those questions together, because it's a process. So like this summer, I'm going to go to Nebraska, to Lincoln, Nebraska, where, you know, our sandhill cranes that we have around here, the really tall birds with the red, and they stand in the road and don't seem to care. They don't ever get out of the way, those guys. So they migrate from the southeast, tens and tens and tens of thousands, and they go through this really narrow corridor in Nebraska over the Platte River Valley on their way to the Arctic every year. So at this one location around Lincoln, you can see like hundreds of thousands of birds on their way to the Arctic, right around March. And so they're also planning to extend the XL Keystone pipeline right through that migration corridor. So there's a huge debate in Lincoln locally about that conflict. And I'm going there to make a project with that community so we can just talk about that debate, both sides of it, and just have the people in town come together to make some art with me so they can just talk about it. Because I think often what happens in these really polarized political debates is we just don't want to talk to each other anymore, period. This side doesn't want to talk to that side. And we take sides. And so it's a much more complicated issue. And we should be able to talk across those barriers to each other. So I think art can do that too. Yes?
I noticed one of the recurring themes in your talk, aside from climate change, kind of like a sidekick to climate change, was cultural change.
Yes.
When you were in Namibia, you talked about that, and I can see that also kind of being infused into your Cuba, whatever project you take on there.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, do you see that as also being part of the climate change umbrella, culture in and of itself?
Absolutely. I think culture is. So this question was about whether culture could be under the climate change umbrella. I think it is. I think that's why climate change is such a great example of a hyperobject, because it's everything. If you start thinking about it, it really relates to everything that we do. And yeah, so if you're living in a culturally maybe isolated country, like parts of Namibia are very isolated, but now you have through globalization, you have people like me coming into your village, right? I'm not only just showing up there magically, I've spent money and taken planes to get to your village, right? And so that mechanism of globalization and pushing populations of people together who were not in the same space before is really going to change the way we view ourselves, change those cultures, right? Me visiting the Himba village has really changed me too. It's changed my perceptions on a lot of things. So I think those are all good things, but they're all related to climate change. Every time we move ourselves around the planet like that, and we have more and more opportunities to do so, right, we make an impact on climate. Good question. Yeah?
You talked about the layers of media that you build into your books, but I also diverse,
yeah,
not necessarily related. Would you talk about your building on those images?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look through any of the journals, you'll see drawings, you'll see lino-cut prints, you'll see collage. You know, I think I've always been interested in lots of stuff, and I'm interested in surfaces that are really complex and that have, my mother loves to use the word eclectic, but I like that quality. Being able to look through a single piece of work and see not just stylistically different things, but different materials and different ways of approaching description, right? How could I describe those hammerheads? Lots of ways, but I chose to use a repeated lino-cut stamp to do that. I think those choices are always related to how we think about those objects or how we think about those ideas and how they're best expressed. You know, and as a printmaker too, I think printmakers are pretty experimental in terms of what they like to try and the different materials that they like to do. I think teaching at a really small liberal arts school where I am the only printmaker, and for a long time was the second person in a two-person studio program, I taught everything. I mean, so like my skill base is very, very wide. I taught things from figure drawing to who knows, everything. So yeah, I'm very versatile in that way, and I've always embraced that. I've always been like, yeah, I like to do a lot of different things, and it's okay to do that. Good question.
I think we have time for one more question. All right, okay, we're good. Thank you.
Thank you.